Well, it's been over 10 years since we've had music from this band, so how are we going to kind of approach this? And this isn't really the first one that we've talked about from a band that's had a very long hiatus. Some have worked really well, others have been a little bit of a lackluster. So where do we find ourselves with this one? Well, we're going to dive in.
I love you to bits. I love you to pieces.
Love You to Bits by No Man. So No Man is a really, really interesting band. So we already know Steven Wilson. I don't think we really need to go into too much detail about his work. I mean, I will touch upon it a little bit. Tim Bowness has been really interesting. I really have enjoyed his own work. I really enjoyed his Lost in the Ghostlight in 2017, and he released a new album this year, Flowers at the Scene. I haven't had a chance to kind of dive in or check that out, and that's kind of No Man's kind of claim to fame. They're much more space rock. They're much more impressionistic. They're not so much about creating grandiose soundscapes. They're much more of like an intimate band. They're much more of a personal kind of creating atmosphere with sounds, mainly on the synthesizer, sometimes a little bit with like a spacey guitar kind of riff and lick along those lines. And so what do we get with Love You to Bits? Yeah, it's interesting. It's very, very different from anything else that No Man has done. It's much more tangible, I feel. It's a lot more almost dance-like, which is very prominent with that front cover of that disco ball. But I feel like it really kind of captures the moods that we're going to be getting into. They still heavily emphasize mood setting. They still very heavily emphasize these longer stretches of music that try and experiment different sounds and different things. And at the end of the day, I actually enjoy this a lot more than almost anything else that No Man has put out. It reminds me very much of Porcupine Tree and Steven Wilson's early stuff. Like, we're looking from anything from Signified, from Porcupine Tree back. Like, in particular, this feels very much like The Sky Moves Sideways. It's also influenced by the modern music that Steven is putting out, being a little bit more poppy in approach. Almost like, I don't want to use the word disco, but very much like a disco dance feel to it. And the music that's found on here is very, very interesting as well. Like, the whole track really lays the groundwork right within the first minute or so of like distancing itself from the past works of No Man. It feels very like neo-noir, future sci-fi, something that we've had within a little bit of time, but specifically to like the 80s. Like, this is very much like a Blade Runner, or even like Blade Runner 2049, but more in a techno electronica version. Like, if we're looking at the Jean-Michel Jarre, this feels also very similar to some of the video games of the early 90s, especially within the second part of Love You to Pieces. It feels very much like the soundtrack to a Sega Genesis game that I had growing up called Subterranea. If you guys haven't checked that out, I really recommend that you do, because it's very similar to that very 16-bit type of music, not quite 8-bit, but very much 16-bit, where there's a little bit more dynamics, a little bit more harmonizations, a little bit fuller styles of the spectrum of sounds, but really introducing and really overlaying themselves, again, in a very like sci-fi neo-noir aspect. I'm getting a lot of these really, really dark colors, but very bright neon stuff. Like, I'm thinking a lot of blues, a lot of purples in particular. I'm getting a lot of that purple feel from this album. And this is the atmosphere that we find ourselves in predominantly within this album as a whole. And this allows for the two individuals, both Tim and Steven, working really well together in this playground that calls back to that early 90s of like The Sky Moves Sideways within Porcupine Tree, and then just explore that landscape. It's a very, very fun time to find yourself in this trance dance style of music. Now, the album, in my mind, is split up into two halves. You have Love You to Bits and Love You to Pieces. And I know that they break them up by movements, but in my mind, it's folly to do that. I feel like it's one complete piece. And much like these dual tracks, very similar to, say, Voyage 37, or 47? No, it's 37. The first half is definitely where it's at. The second half wavers a little bit, and I feel like they've painted themselves into a little bit of a corner. But I want to talk about the first half, the Love You to Bits parts. I mean, they say bits 1 to 5, but for me, it's Love You to Bits. I love this essence. I love how they really hunkered down and really nailed down that root of this song. That continuation of I love you to bits, I love you to pieces. Like, that repetition of this really gets it into your head. And if it were anything that was less catchy and less enjoyable, this wouldn't be a great time. And I feel like that's why a lot of people aren't really gravitating to this album quite as much, because if you're not on board for this, they do repeat it a lot. And so if you're not into that kind of a trance dance type of a music, then you're not really going to get into this album very much. I am, and I'm definitely along for the ride, and I'm really, really digging it. I love the build-ups and I love the experimentations that we have, especially within that mid part where it's either the guitars or the synths that we have within there. And Tim Bowness, his vocal works are so clean and so crisp and so sincere. Steven's harmonization work on there is really, really fantastic. And I feel like Steven is the main producer of this album, where Tim is really just allowed to explore and really test the waters. And so the two working really well in tandem with one another really produce a fantastic, like, 17 minutes worth of this trance dance fun aspect of music, and those experimentations are just fantastic. Like, I can't get over what they're able to do. Sometimes they really, really work, sometimes they just work, but never is it a dud. Never do they fly on their face or anything along those lines. And I love the build-ups, and I love how they kind of groove right back into that main theme again. And this is a type of song that I have to listen to with a really, really good pair of headphones, and quite loud as well. And so when I know that I'm turning up the volume, that we're dealing with something very, very special on our hands. Now, Love You to Pieces is a little bit different. And it's interesting because it starts off much more quiet, a little bit more somber. It's a little bit more on the experimental side. It's much more like seeing what works and seeing what doesn't. And I was surprised to see that they continue with this Love You to Bits, Love You to Pieces suite, but they're experimenting in a different light. Instead of just like letting it be and trying something completely new, which I was almost hoping that they would do, they try and recapture this in a different light. And sometimes it works, and sometimes in the second part it doesn't. Like, I was a little, I don't want to say disappointed, but a little intrigued with the fact that they're still hunkering down to that main route. You know, I don't want to say they're afraid to move away from it, because I also feel like this really plays a part of this, like, essence, this obsession, because that's kind of one of the main themes of this album. It's kind of like talking about love, but in an obsessive way, and what love can do, both in a good way and in a bad way, like how frightening it can be in any other kind of a context outside of like a mutually beneficial, consenting love. Sometimes it can be quite frightening if it's just the one person who's completely obsessed with another person, or if it's these two people that are frightened of how much they depend on one another. And this is kind of where those whole themes of like, I love you to bits, I love you to pieces, it's like we're deconstructing this into like this strange automative world. And this blends very well within the music that we have, and it's this obsession, it's not being able to let go. And I thought that was a really interesting way of presenting the music that's found on this album. Even though I was really, really hoping that the second part of Love You to Pieces would have ended with a really big crashing crescendo, and I never found it. I felt like this album was one that kind of faded away instead of like really burning to a bright light by the end, and that was a little bit of a letdown, because I feel like as much as I love the beginning, once we get into that second part and it starts to wind itself down, I am starting to check out. And at the end, I want to be craving to listen to it again, as opposed to craving to listen to the first part again, because I do find myself listening to this album on repeat, but not because I'm interested in hearing that second part, but more because I really want to get back to that brilliance that the first half of this album had. As it stands right now, I'm loving this. This is definitely my favorite No Man projects that I've had so far. This is one that I would have absolutely no problem picking up in physical format, and I might just have to do so because of how well structured it is. So that's about it. That's it for No Man's Love You to Bits. What did you guys think? Did you love it? Did you hate it? Let me know of your own thoughts by commenting down below. Thank you guys so much for watching. As always, you guys are definitely the best. And until next time, notes out.